for someone of your background and your kind of caliber, it's going to be difficult for us to perhaps stay on a coherent line of discussion. But I think one thing that I hope to get out of this conversation, one of many, is just to understand the journey you went on to starting the London School of Architecture, and perhaps where the future lies for architectural pedagogy in a completely evolving profession. In my eyes, as the kind of the recent graduating generation in architecture school, I thought I was talking about something really progressive towards the end of my education, like, oh, architecture education needs to drastically change. We need to accommodate for a diversifying architectural service template so that we can allow more multidisciplinary, blah, 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 right? That's the ethos I came to conclusion with, as a result of also doing this podcast throughout my education as well. But then reading into what you've done, it seems like you're way ahead of the curve. And you mentioned in what you wrote for The Citizen, I believe, that it was also a really important time on this journey was the recession, and when the university fees hiked up to like 3 times what we usually pay for, and you had a moment of realization there that something was going to go wrong, or there was an opportunity in the midst.
Yes, I was teaching at the Royal College of Art at the time, and it's aware of what the sort of budgets were like and what we were offering, and thinking, actually, when the fees go up to £9,000 a year, what do you spend that money on? So I think it was opportunistic in some senses, because the government had also announced that they wanted to allow new entrants into the higher education market. So I naively believed what the government said, that it was going to be easy to do this, and was thinking about, well, what could this new model be? So I think it was slightly opportunistic, but also trying to address this need that actually tuition fees going up really does, increase debt for students with limited means, and that's going to be problematic for architectural education. I mean, putting them up to £9,000 a year. I'm in America at the moment at Harvard, and the fees can be £100,000 a year, or it costs a lot to study here. So that £9,000 sounds like nothing, but I think cumulatively, when you look at how much you do spend on fees and then how much you can earn as an architect, there's something slightly wrong there.
Yeah, and this is where I really hope the conversation will go, because I think there's something fundamental there to what the discourse was that allowed you to succeed in creating, well, the first independent architecture school for more than a century, and then also where I think the trajectory of the pedagogy is going today, as we kind of step into a virtualized world where the same frustration is still bubbling away of what the hell is the point of going through this educational process that costs so much mentally and financially and physically, actually, that gives us very little results financially. And so this is essentially the core of what I want to kind of get your 2 cents on, or hopefully more than 2 cents. But, one of the things that I find interesting is, your background. You teach it at the Royal College of Art. What was your architectural education like?
So I studied at the Royal College of Art as well, and my professor was Nigel Coates, and he was the one who encouraged me to teach there. So he was a patron of mine to sort of promote my career. So he was very helpful. And then before that, I was at the Bartlett. So I was at sort of 2 London schools, and that's pretty much been the context of how I learned architecture.
So what was it actually like? Because, the Bartlett right now, well, I mean, I'm obviously closed-minded in one sense, because I don't know how education in architecture used to be. Say, I mean, you're not that much older than me, but you might.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm going to be honest here. You probably get this a lot, but you look very young.
I've had a lot of work done.
So when I realized that you were, well, I don't know how old you are, and I daren't ask.
I'm 40. I'm 40. I'm turning 41 in March.
That's just crazy. You do not look 40 at all. And it's, well, look, even so, I'm curious what architectural education was like you know, in a kind of informalized description, you know, like for me, I would say the Bartlett, everyone knows the Bartlett to be the place to be when it comes to going and doing the crazy, fantastical projects right on the forefront of innovation. You know, loads of different universities have these reputations. But this frustration that students feel is palpable everywhere, of, you know, what I just described. Like we're in a profession where we have to do so many kind of imaginatively fictional things as part of our course. I mean, we have to in order to succeed. And then when you leave university, you're in the BIM world doing Revit door details, and it's like, you know, was that disjunct still there in your time in architecture school?
I think, you know, when I started at the Bartlett in 1999, and it was felt like the beginning of computers in some ways. You know, Google was seen as like a new website. I remember finding out about Google and Yahoo, and that was, you know, they felt like the coming thing. So I think it was at that tipping point where the first year at the Bartlett was very hands-on and drawing by hand as well. It was run by Frosso Pimenides and still is, and was influenced by people like Peter Salter, and it was often about the poetry of spaces and rethinking how you interact with space in quite a conceptual way. And I think it still does that. I think we started, you know, I started using things like MicroStation, but it still felt kind of clunky. And I think now, the education, it's a very different generation that is interacting with education, and the sort of generational shift of speaking about mental health, putting mental health at the forefront, and thinking about what's the experience and the environment like of architecture school. And I think, you know, at the time I was doing it, there was a lot of pressure and competitiveness. And I think that's probably still the case, but I think there's probably a heightened awareness of how to cope with that pressure, how to support people with that amount of pressure. And I think pressure is in many ways a good thing, because you learn how to cope with it. You know, life doesn't get any less pressured. So actually being in education and learning to push yourself through your boundaries to do something, I still think is very important.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like, although we are becoming super aware of it, and in some ways, you know, rightfully so, obviously, when you know, many people can draw on experiences where they've seen someone physically, mentally break down in architecture school, or they themselves have. I mean, once I was doing a crit and I saw, you know, someone was looking like a bit washed out, and eventually they passed out, and an ambulance was called in. And it's just this very surreal moment where you're standing there in your studio, like this is, like, in some way this is crazy, but in other ways, like, damn, I'm not so surprised by this. You know, a number of hours that, you know, that competitive culture can pull you into putting in is extremely unhealthy. And, you know, you've seen these all-nighter cultures now get a lot of heat and a lot of stick now. And I want to kind of get into what the LSA is doing differently, obviously, in a second, or what you intended it to be when you started it. But what I'm getting from you is that culture, or, you know, the architectural school competitive culture was quite difficult even when you were studying.
I think the Bartlett was especially competitive, let's say. The Royal College of Art, because it was in an art school, felt just more friendly as an institution in some ways. And actually interacting with other creative disciplines, I think, was enriching. It's probably like this in lots of architecture schools. They kind of become autonomous because everyone is working so hard, everyone interacts with each other so much. It's quite hard to forge connections outside of that. So something like the Royal College was really beneficial to be able to actually be friends with all these different people creating in different ways.
That's a really good point, actually, that, you know, I think whatever university you go to can really shape the way you see the world's problems or the profession's problems, and the same goes for the solutions. So that's an important note to kind of put on the side. But if it's okay, could you please just take me back to that moment that we talked about where you're thinking, shit, this is a lot of money. that students are going to have to pay for a profession that's not exactly the most rewarding. How do you
Well,
go?
I think just touching on what you briefly said a second ago and picking up on this, putting, in the REBA guidelines, you have to, one of the criteria is relating architecture to fine art. And I think, having an architecture school in an art school is a certain context in which to practice. And I think that wasn't the context that I wanted to create. It was about trying to relate architecture to industry and to other disciplinary knowledge that is more applied. And I think, being in an art school is one way of doing it, but I think there's been too much emphasis probably on architecture as a kind of personal art practice where you have to express your values through the form you make. I think there's other demands on architecture at the moment, such as climate change, social justice, lots that need a different level of thinking, which is not just art practice. It's got to have it's a different set of skills.
Right. And there's so much there that we can hopefully talk about soon, which is, if we're looking at the future of architecture school and discussing the drastic changes that the ARB are putting in place, and independently the universities themselves, how they're evolving to a changing landscape, it does beg the question that, what is the future of architecture school when it comes to the manifestation of the value that the students can contribute to society when leaving? And it's, one example of, I think that's a good framework to kind of look at it, because if you think, what are the students doing when they leave that school after performing at the highest level? The example comes up of the Bartlett, where a lot of people are going perhaps slightly outside of the profession and doing things on the very fringe. My good friend and a guest of episode 3, I believe, on this podcast, Eric Wong, has now recently been selected, employed by a Japanese anime award-winning director to build the entire world for the animation film. And it's just like, what? He did not expect to do that, but this is the potential of architecture, and it's scary, but also incredibly inspiring to think that that's what an architectural education can do for you. But in the same way as you described, you might end up going into the humanitarian fields. You might end up going into thought leadership politically. You might end up going into the sustainable discourse. There's so much there. And I think that the difficulty is figuring out how a profession can have so much wider potential, but is understood by lay people as such a constricted and kind of simple profession. What do you think about that? The kind of discrepancy in the way the public sees us and how, let's say, I don't know, how I see us.
I think Peter Buchanan, who is the reader of architecture and urbanism at the LSA, talks about design is the way that humans can consciously participate in evolution. And I think, at its most profound, that is what architecture can do. It's about how you spatially organize humanity on the planet so that we can live within its resources and prosper. And that is a huge challenge for us to think about, and needs more visionary thinking than less visionary thinking. And as Naomi Klein says, there's no non-radical solutions left at this point. So I would like architecture to have that kind of imagination about a radical shift on how we inhabit the planet. I think that's the most fundamental core purpose that we can look at. But I think in terms of the profession, I think you're right. People should see design as, you can design a process as much as you might design a teacup. So there's definitely adjacent disciplines to be looking at, which are, totally valid routes and important routes. But I also think fundamentally, architects have to be able to handle space and form and be able to make great buildings that people want to use and use them in a way that works well for everybody. So I think we should. I don't think we should lose sight as the core competency of the architect to design buildings from a range of scales that fit the brief. I think that's imperative.
Yeah, completely. And so where do you think you lie in this? I guess one way of kind of getting to that answer is to ask what I previously asked of kind of, can you take me back to that moment in which you're realizing that there is something, we're on the precipice of something pivotal with the way that architecture education is going to be made even more inaccessible financially, and therefore that means something. What was going on in your mind at that point?
I think it was trying to sense and feel the way into what this new opportunity could be, and thinking about what are the assets I have that I can bring to it. First, a bit of naivety about how, can't be that hard to start school. Second, that actually being executive editor of the Architectural Review, I knew a lot of practices. I already had connections with lots of people and relationships to leverage, both in practice and academia. So starting to speak to other people, and there were many collaborators for the school who input tons of ideas and made it happen. Trying to get a sense of building a coalition to sound people out and say, oh, hey, what do you think about a new school? And everyone, when it's like pushing at an open door, because everyone wants to make a new school. So in a way, that was kind of the great opportunity. It was at a moment where things like Airbnb were happening, and there seemed an idea that actually as a young person, you can become an entrepreneur and you can start something. You don't have to wait in line and do everything in order. You can try and leap ahead a bit and make something new. So it was excitement about also what could happen, not just sort of dread about what was happening in the system. And also I should say, I think, UK higher education, the architecture schools in the UK deliver a fantastic range of approaches towards making architects. So I think it wasn't about trying to diss what was happening in other schools, but about trying to create an alternative that could have some agency.
Yeah. So that momentum that you were feeling, that kind of shift that you were feeling was everything is interconnected, and in many ways that, as you're describing, was you could parallel that with the changes to the entrepreneurial energy, or the entrepreneurial kind of opportunities, or the acceptance to go into entrepreneurship, should I say. That was obviously an influencing force. But you mention it in a way, you say it in a way that a lot of people wanted to start a new school. Are you saying that in a kind of generalized sense that, who wouldn't want to start a new school? Or is this specific to the time?
No, I think it's been around for a while, because, I used to work for Will Alsop, and he would talk about the school he wanted to create, and he's always thought about making a school. And, at the AA I think it was the 1980s, there was an idea of, rebelling against Alvin Boyarsky and creating a new school called the London School of Architecture. So I think it had been around for a time, and we didn't know about that at the time. So when the name was proposed, we didn't really have any idea that was a previous thing. And weirdly, it had a lot of similar ideas in some ways. So it's quite interesting that if you look through the history books, there's often talk of the London School of Architecture, and it at times it refers to the Architectural Association, and at times refers to the Bartlett School of Architecture. And it's been this sort of fugitive label running through the sort of footnotes of history, and never really sticking to one institution. So it sort of finally found a home for itself and coalesced into something.
That is fascinating. I never knew that.
Weird. It's totally weird. I only found out when I was sort of leaving the LSA and trying to research the name, and found all this stuff. And I was like, that is so strange.
Yeah, and I suppose it says a lot about the kind of being in the right place at the right time. Obviously, I'm not talking about luck as much as I'm talking about manifesting your kind of fate, if I dare say it. Just because you seem to be the person who was taking the most action, perhaps had the most energy. I mean, I want to also ask how you were able to start a school, or at least, kind of lead that vision in and amongst all of the things you were doing at the time. I mean, what was the first step? If you could even call it a step.
It was starting to write about it. So starting to think, how do we create leverage? So we started to have meetings with people. So the same museum hosted one, and I'm trying to think where else. We had them. We used to have the members club, so the Groucho Club. We had one. We went to lots of little members clubs for these meetings. So they felt kind of like secret collaborator meetings, working on something.
And when you say
And
we, sorry, when you say we, who's we?
so people like Clive Saul, Nigel Coates, Deborah Saunt, Tom Holbrook, Lewis Kinnear, Alan Powers, Leon Van Skyke. I'm probably missing someone out, so I'm sorry about that. But yeah, so there was a good body of people, most of whom took a role within the school as we opened. So we started to think about what roles people might take. I started writing about it a lot in public because I worked at BD in the Architects Journal, Architectural Review, so I had sort of outlets I could write about it, trying to build momentum. I mean, it was quite slow. It took from 2010 to end of 2010 to 2015 to open it. So I wouldn't say it was very fast.
I mean, you might not say that's fast, but to the untrained eye, I mean, it seems incredibly rapid to establish a school. One would think that takes centuries to actually establish itself and put itself on the same level as, well, schools that have existed for centuries.
I think if I were to do it again, if I was, let's say, to try and do it in New York, I think I'd be a lot quicker because I'd know all the steps to go through.
And maybe that has something to say about kind of the place for disruptive institutions nowadays as well. I think we're much more able to kind of build momentum and market intensely these new movements because of the tools available to us at the time, to us at the moment.
Well, I think you sort of pick on a paradox there where it's a disruptive institution, because often institutions become institutionalized and they end up, repeating, they get top heavy, they get bureaucratic, they do things a certain way, they have regulators to, speak to. I think we've tried to keep that disruptive, agile sense of the school as far as possible while integrating deeply into a regulatory regime that requires institutional frameworks for everything, all processes. And I think that's a real tension to try and navigate to ensure you can do that. But I think I think you're right, people are more open. If we couldn't get students, if we couldn't convince students to come to try something new, then there'd be no school. It relies on people being open to try something new. Sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead, please.
And there's a new university opening in the University of Austin, Texas. That's people are trying in America as well to open disruptive institutions, and I think it's a really interesting challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be a whole episode to talk about how you keep a disruptive organization from becoming institutionalized when it becomes so successful. Because I suppose institutionalized or institutional is somewhat synonymous with established, and everything needs to be established to some degree to be successful. I suppose to kind of keep the chronology going of your journey, writing about it. I mean, that's a brilliant answer and insight, because obviously, I think because something so complicated and so drastic is obviously got so many factors at play. And I mean, it seems obvious now. Yes, the first thing to do is to be able to get the ideas out there, build the momentum. But what happens after that? Obviously, I could easily imagine that's the essential force for starting to get players interested. And was it the case that when it started to cascade in terms of popularity, and it kind of, did it get out of hand and started becoming a monster in of itself?
I don't think it's a monster. I certainly wouldn't go that far. I think it's I think what started was the sort of rationale that if you get practices interested, then you'll get students, because if you can work with successful practices and there's a route for students to get jobs, and it's a practice-based course in some ways. So there's a part-time placement in first year where students earn money that can help offset their tuition fees. We started with 30 practices. I think there's now about 200. And, so that was trying to organize those relationships and then consolidate them. I think writing about it, the other thing to do is it creates a rod for my own back, in that making it public then forced me to make it happen. So I was slightly aware that it would put pressure on me to deliver it.
Do you mean making it public from a business point of view, or do you mean
from a totally personal point of view? As soon as you put your reputation on the line and say you're going to do this, you've then got to try and actually really make it happen.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that must have
not
been a difficult process.
Actually, in a funny way, it wasn't difficult. It was all, everything came together. You know, the ARB is really clear about what it wants. You read the stuff and you follow it. The government made clear about how you set up a new institution, clear up to a point. You know, there was a process in place that if you read it and try and synthesize it, which is what you're trained to do as an architect, then you have to make the steps to deliver it. And most things went according to plan. I mean, there was a few moments where you have to try and keep everything together, but I wouldn't say that it, looking back, was difficult. But it might be like, you know, I hear that childbirth, you know, women in hindsight don't remember the pain, and maybe it was like that. But it feels like it was relatively straightforward looking back.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because when I mean I haven't started a school or anything, but or given birth for that fact, for that matter. But you know, people ask me, how do you do? I mean, it's a question I find difficult to answer, because when people say, oh, how do you do so many things, or how do you do X, Y, and Z while doing X, Y, and Z? And it's just like, it is a bit of a blur when you're in that mode of just, I have a job to do, I have a purpose to fulfill. So I can see how you probably were, you know, I mean, I think it probably was a massive feat and massive task to undertake.
But you learn, like, actually going back to what we were saying earlier, being a graduate of things like the Bartlett and the Royal College, you learn to work under pressure. You've got to deliver. You can't, yeah. In a way, like knowing that it's just pressure. It's like an ephemeral thing. And that at any point, if you don't want to be under the pressure anymore, you can stop, you can leave. You always have a choice to just walk away from it. So I think it's a way of just handling that stress and being excited about it. You know, starting something new is exciting. So at least that's the, you know, it's much easier starting something than leaving something.
So how do we deal? I mean, obviously you have a pedagogical, but you have an academic background in terms of teaching. You've obviously dealt with many students, you know, constantly. How do you deal with that question, or that difficulty nowadays of, you know, your position is very much, you know, I recognize pressure is a given, and anything of, perhaps you could argue, worth doing is going to have a high level of pressure and competitivity, you know, as a given. What's your position on that in sort of today's climate, and what would you advise students who are kind of asking that question?
I think every student should have a proper work-life balance, like every person should. So I think trying to figure out how much time you want to spend on something, and pushing back on the institution at times if you feel you're being overworked and unnecessarily worked, I think is important. I think also being aware of when you feel under pressure, being aware of your body. When do you start feeling under pressure? What's happening to you, and just acknowledging it and finding ways to either cope with it or seek help, or, you know, if you really need to struggle, take a break. My real message would be, you always have a choice. You don't have to, you can always just stop. You don't have to worry about it. Just take a break. Doesn't matter.
I think that's a very sober answer. Yeah. And I think many people would hesitate to say that, because they would think, you know, they would think that you should make the course easier if that's possible, or you should make the requirements less. And I know you just said that, you know, part of that it probably is to make it known to the institution that there are things that are difficult. But surely,
I think sometimes in architecture schools there's a sense of mystifying things in a way that they don't have to be mystified. Architecture in some senses is relatively straightforward in that the objective should be clear. Now, how you do that is really complicated. And there's architecture is the nexus of all disciplines. You have to engage with everything. So it's not easy, and it's a professional qualification. It can't actually be made simpler often. There's a certain amount of stuff that you do have to know as a threshold point to become a professional.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so at this point now, when the professions were getting involved, when you were pulling in these practices, that must have been the tipping point, I imagine. And you kind of touched on it, that's perhaps when you became public with it. Was that the point at which okay, now this is going to take off?
I think I only really knew it would take off when we opened and when the students showed up. There was always that nervousness that you'd be stood in an empty room on the first day.
So how do you actually get to the point where a student walks in? Because, let's say, okay, so now you've got on a kind of informal level, people agreed to sign up to this scheme where they would be, helping students out. And in return, what would they be getting? What's the kind of transaction being made here with these practices?
We found that practices were very interested in engaging with education so that they could actually engage with each other and think critically about the challenges that design faces and how design can become an agent for change within the city. And I think there's a real hunger for that, to be thinking outside of commission projects. So we've certainly found it easy to reach practices on that professional level. Also, practices want to help students. They're certainly aware that they need a pipeline of talented people coming into the profession. And if they can get talented people earlier on who bring a different cultural perspective to design, then that's totally to their benefit.
Yeah, and there's something there as well in terms of why I think this was such a success, in my eyes, and many others, obviously, but is by I mentioned to you at the beginning of this episode that one of the biggest frustrations students feel is that they come out of architecture school completely unprepared for the realities of practice. And by embedding them within the practice at an earlier stage, they become privy to it. And then they're able to actually add way more value than let's say, a regular graduate would. Was that part of the intention, or was the intention to create something that was, I suppose, more affordable, or was it all of these things?
I think all of those things. I think it has to be a more affordable route, but also a route. We were definitely interested in engaging with the profession so that students did have that network, professional network and professional understanding right from the beginning. And I think the challenge is to ensure that the institution also challenges practices to think differently, and also that students have the opportunity to shape their architecture in a way that isn't necessarily tied to the practice they're in. So asking students to say, what do you want your architecture to be about? What change do you want to see in the world? How can your architecture contribute it? And who do you want to be as a designer? They're kind of primary questions, because if you don't think about it as a student, then you don't get the opportunity again. So you've really got to use that time to figure out who you are as a designer, so that you have that understanding about what matters to you.
Yeah, and in this framework, there's some obviously one of the distinctifying factors is that students would only be in university for like 2 days, right, of the week.
In first year, yeah.
So in first year, they're in Go ahead.
In second year, they're based fully in the studio.
So the first year is the only work in which they're being exposed to the working world, and they're embedded within practice 3 days a week.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm also really curious about getting accreditation, or at least I suppose the right to call yourself a school. I mean, I'm sure not everyone can just start a company and a business and get people to attend it and suddenly they call themselves a school. Or is that really how easy it is? And it's just a matter of, if the ARB or RIBA recognize you, then you'll just have more interest from the students and practices.
So you can call yourself a school, that's fine. There's no protection around that. The protected title is university. So we can't call ourselves a university. the government has made a route for new entrants to become universities in a quicker process. And for that, you need enough financial robustness that you can demonstrate that a student coming to you won't be joining a course that is going to close. So just setting up a school is fine. You just register the name with the Charity Commission. You have to, go through a process to show how you will meet charitable objectives. ARB, you have to go through a process where you write a course framework and materials that meets all of their requirements, which is to do with the learning criteria, but also processes and procedures that demonstrate robustness. And if you are not a university, if you don't have degree awarding powers, you have to be validated by an academic institution. So we were validated by London Metropolitan University first, and now Liverpool University. So you have to be validated by them first and then give the validated course to the ARB.
Right. So there's actually not much kind of bureaucracy in the way to get yourself to be, the founder of a new school.
There is, bureaucracy is also an enabler of things because it tells you what you need to do something. So I think the ARB and ROBA is much simpler than the government bureaucracy, which is complicated because it's emerging. They've written all this stuff. They want new entrants. A lot of the challenges that come up, they haven't thought about, or it's not there yet. They have to shape policy. That is much more complicated because for someone like the LSA, which is small, and a course that is an undergraduate master's level. What's that? It's confused. It's things that they don't necessarily have on their radar. So I think we were challenging to that institutional framework. Right. But we did it. So we got through it.
Yeah, well, and you also say that if you did it in America, you could do it even quicker.
Well, I wouldn't want to be held to that, but I'd have thought knowing the steps and once you've done something once, it becomes much easier to convince people to do it again.
But it also suggests that there are less, I suppose, I'm not sure the terminology, maybe bureaucracy is the right word, but there's less kind of loopholes maybe to jump through if you think you can apply that to America, unless you are very, very kind of privy to the American loopholes to jump through, if that makes sense.
I'm not. It was a throwaway remark, so I'm not. I don't have conceived plans to do anything.
Oh man, that's a shame. I was hoping there would be the New York School of Architecture or something coming soon.
I think it's an interesting idea because I think in a way America is it's a much bigger scale country that has a different set of challenges, but also more, quite pronounced inequality. And something interesting could happen here. But also a lot of students, at Harvard are getting full tuition fee, scholarships. So they're not paying the huge fees. So there are routes into the profession, I think, that are much more financially supported.
So just to be blunt, what are you doing in America and Harvard right now?
So I'm a Loeb Fellow, which is 10 fellows a year based at the Graduate School of Design, but you can take classes across MIT or Harvard, any of the schools. And our purpose is for mid-career change makers in the built environment who are thinking about what to do next and would be enriched by engaging with this community and are often trying to pivot into something new.
And was that opportunity presented to yourself sort of after the London School of Architecture kind of materialized, or was this just a separate thing going on?
It was something I applied for pre-pandemic and was shortlisted for, and then it was cancelled for a year. So it'd been on my radar for a while, and then it seemed a really good thing to aim towards as a way to exit the school. And actually, at the time I resigned from the school, I didn't know whether I had it or not. But I thought I wanted to give a year's notice because it felt as a founder, there should be sufficient time. And they only would tell you about the Harvard gig in April. It starts in August. So it was too tight. and you can't defer. So it was like, how do I make that work? So I gambled that I would get it, and thankfully I did.
Amazing. And I think I heard you say in an interview that you're essentially getting paid or supported to just sit and come up with some entrepreneurial ideas, or sort of the next entrepreneurial project that you're working on.
It's a really privileged position in that you are supported and housed and given money, and you have no set outputs apart from you have to go for dinner once a fortnight with an invited guest and talk to each other. And so, I mean, it's like the unbelievably best gig in the world. Actually perfect, having run something for 6 years from operation. It's been nice to have 6 months grace period to really relax and think about what the next thing might be, of which I have no ideas.
Yeah. And like you say you have no ideas, but you must sort of be, I mean, what are you working towards at the moment?
I'd like a green card. I mean, that's something I was thinking about. So how to stay in America. And that puts its own pressure on you because you have to demonstrate what value you bring to the country. So that means sort of developing a business plan. And but I think America seems like there's much more opportunity here in terms of raising money for ventures. It's a much more open financial culture to try risk taking. I've been doing things at the business school, and you're being taught by people who run the largest impact investment fund, and they're your professor, and you sort of are able to engage with this community in a way that is you can't access in the same way, I don't think, in London.
Right. And it's just kind of dawning on me that, you seem like somebody who had always had an entrepreneurial bug. Am I wrong in thinking that?
I think design training is really good for that. Certainly something like the Royal College, which is very focused on London, focused on making propositions. You are taught to think, well, what change do you want? And then how do you deliver it? And I think that does lead you to being entrepreneurial, certainly for me.
Well, yeah. So what that's such a good point, because what is that connection between, let's say, design thinking and coming up with an entrepreneurial vision, if you like? Where is the crossover there, and how were you able to translate those skills into the other skills?
I think it's just being strategic and thinking. Certainly Clive Saul, who was teaching at the Royal College, focused a lot on what trying to figure out what your end game is, what's your strategy for it. He was a close collaborator for the school. I think design is ultimately about a strategy for delivering something and figuring out how to make something happen, and also building relationships with people and being able to keep enough people on board that you can keep moving forward and not letting too many people fall off the ship.
Yeah, and I think it would be a really good moment to kind of just share some of these early stage drawings or sketches that you did. If you can see my screen.
Yeah.
So those of you who are listening to the podcast, you can easily watch this podcast as well on YouTube, all for free. Just go to the YouTube channel. It's under my name, so Hamza Shaikh, but you can just search for the Two Worlds Design Podcast. So yeah, so Will, we've got this sketch. Do us the honors of describing what it is, if you can, and just saying, because I think this has a lot to do with what we were just talking about. You yourself trained in the visual arts, being in this artistic environment, and also architecturally trained. You started coming up with these ideas for a new school in a very architectural way, might I say.
So this was when I was in Los Angeles, staying with a couple of friends, Natalie Loren and Eleni Renton. We were thinking about planning our lives out and what we were going to do. So this was New Year's resolutions for 2011, and on it is relaunching the Architectural Review and writing a book on Peter Salter, which didn't happen. But the thing about the pub, which shows a pint glass, I think is about the design of the pub rather than going to the pub. But this is the first drawing I think I can find of the idea of the school. At the time I was calling it Alpha, Alternative Learning for Architecture, I think it was. Then I thought Alpha as a acronym sounded a bit too macho for me. So it became alternative routes for architecture, Arthur. And the first drawing of it was people sat around a table, a diverse community of people sat around a table discussing ideas about how you can make a new school. And that became a think tank that then made a proposition about what this new school might be.
And I really do love this because, the aim of this podcast is to kind of uncover the hidden potential, the multidisciplinary potential of architecture. And here we have, well, the honor of me sitting with you, someone who has been architecturally trained and then went off to start an architecture school that's been probably the most disruptive force to architecture pedagogy in maybe a century or so. And you're now kind of pursuing more entrepreneurial activities at Harvard. And it's like, it's incredibly inspiring to me. And even just looking at this kind of early stage sketch that you did, you could equate this to the architectural process in the sense that we create feasibility drawings and diagrams in the early stages. And you are in a similar way creating a strategic diagram for your business kind of ideas. So
I think design culture and learning to draw your strategy when you're in meetings, you can have the best presentation. Most people use PowerPoint with sort of like competing styles of bullet point, and you can just draw your strategy and show people what you're thinking. And being able to think in spatially and in time and communicate as clearly as possible, I think is imperative to bringing people with you.
That's just music to my ears, because again, one of the things that I try to do a lot is on Instagram. I share a lot of my drawings where I'm just trying to convey ideas, and I really stand by this phrase of we must be able to think through drawing. And it's like, that's, if there's anything you could put your finger on in terms of what is the fundamental thing or the fundamental skill that gives us our USP, if you like, in the fields, and it's like, maybe it is thinking through drawing, that we're able to represent our thoughts, our manifestations, our visions through the medium of drawing something. And this is definitely...
Partly it's thinking through them, and then it's communicating through them.
Yeah.
So I think this was just for me to get things out of my head and onto a sheet of paper, but being able to then bring other people into the drawing and show them it and talk them through what you're thinking and get them on board with it is just a way to enable your collaborators to align with you and also have their input and amend.
But that literally is, again, another architectural school thing, if you like, that we're trained to stand in front of the studio on a regular basis and sell the vision to people. So firstly, you put your thoughts onto paper, and then you communicate it to the rest of the studio, and you try to bring them on board.
And crit culture, as horrible as it can sometimes be, and there are better and worse ways of doing it, but the requirement to stand and present and try and convince people of a strategy is just such an invaluable skill for your professional life, no matter what you go on to do. And actually, bad crits, certainly I've had many horrendous crits, but I then learned quite a lot from them as well. And learning to change tack. I mean, you've got to bin bad ideas. If there's nothing wrong with having a bad idea, we all have bad ideas, but then don't grip onto it. Learn to separate and have the judgment between what is a great idea and what's not such a great idea. And it doesn't mean you're bad. It's just like, oh, okay, fine. Have more ideas. Don't just stick to one.
Incredible. And I want to kind of, so hopefully by the end of this episode as well, I can ask you for some more advice for students to kind of get from their architecture education as well, because you might know it's kind of crit time now, and everyone's going to want to hear these things from you, and that's super inspiring. So here we actually have another diagram. Can you tell us a little bit about this one?
Yeah, this was just trying to come up with a conceptual basis for how it was organized. So trying to move from a hierarchy to a network, so that it's not about top and bottom, but center and periphery. And then trying to look at the idea of the city as campus. So not just having a fixed boundary around the institution, but seeing the whole city as the campus, so that you're a porous institution. and then looking at how you might rethink the pedagogy in terms of the time frame of it. So how is it going to be delivered over time? Are there ways to adapt the number of holidays or integrate it with practice in a different way? And just try to look at what's the existing and then look at the proposed. And I think that's another fundamental skill that architects do and business people have to do. What's the existing condition? What's your critique of it? And how do you want to change it? What can you do that's different? And it can't just be detached from that. It can't be so far detached from it that there's no chance of it happening. You've got to be far ahead to make it interesting, but not so far ahead that people can't get there.
That's amazing. And are you taking these kind of drawings and diagrams with you as you try to convince, various stakeholders and present at, I'm sure, important meetings to kind of initiate interest and mobilization for this project? Or are these just kind of in the archives, very early stage diagrams and sketches that they just kind of stayed in a sketchbook?
Used right up to the end. I mean, I think if you show a triangle next to a circle, just that conceptual idea of what is hierarchy and those top heavy institutions, and how do you then make a network and make it about a series of relationships. Now, there's a tension there because for regulatory purposes, you have to have a hierarchy. There has to be some hierarchy. And also, actually, often to get things done, there needs to be some sort of hierarchy. So there needs to be a way for decisions to be discussed in a way that includes people, but then also there needs to be a decision. So I don't think we perfected necessarily or squared the circle, if not to mix too many shapes. But I think there is a tension there between at what points in an organization do you need something that is quick and directional, and at what points do you need a more collaborative type of leadership.
So let's talk about the actual school then, in terms of what differentiates it from the other schools. Obviously, we mentioned, the kind of the day-to-day structure of the course delivery. Obviously, in first year is going to be different for obvious reasons, and but the second year is this is a part 2 course only, right?
Only part 2 at the moment.
Yeah,
and I believe the institution has plans to launch a part 1.
Yeah. So just in that initial launch as a part 2 course, what was the actual differentiating factors there? Because hierarchy is perhaps one of those things to talk about.
So for the students, the sell was relationship with practice. You have a work placement that helps offset your tuition fee debt. And we started with lower fees. Collaboration. So there's a design think tank project in the first year where students work with practice and collaborate with each other to come up with a proposal for the city. No unit system. So it was about really trying to make you the best version of yourself, not a mini version of your unit master, as they used to be called. And the engagement with the city. So the city as the campus, using London as this test bed, both the places that you learn in. So we have pop-up events in all sorts of venues around the city, but then also moving to a different borough each year and looking at that, embedding yourself in it, understanding the city, and then making a proposal for it. So being able to engage with the community, no big unit trips, spending thousands of pounds going somewhere, engage with the place you're in, which is the world city of London.
And then from the kind of the structure point of view, obviously a disruptive force would have something quite distinct when it comes to structure and the operations. Was there anything there that was distinct?
I mean, I think we've always tried to ensure that the students are co-creating the school with us. So certainly, it's a new institution, making sure your feedback loops are as fast as possible. So, all the students would have my WhatsApp number, to be able to engage quickly, trying to get a sense where students can give you feedback really fast and you can respond to it really fast. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you can always do what the student wants, but then being able to explain why you can't do it, what are the limits of the resourcing, why we're doing it this way. So, but also oftentimes you can change it. So students might have a great idea about, hey, why don't we do it this way? And you, instead of having to go through a year's worth of bureaucracy, you can say, we can do that tomorrow. So trying to be nimble and fast on your feet and saying to students, hey, the school doesn't exist without you. Every year we make the school afresh because you're a new cohort set. You bring new things to the school. You bring your own experiences, and you need to bring that into school and make a shared space with each other and share those things.
I suppose you also had that luxury as well, given that it was quite a small cohort as well. You know, you were able to have that kind of small feedback loop. But what was your actual, so you know, what was your actual involvement in the early stages, or, you know, even throughout, you know, sort of from an operational point of view? Were you tutoring? Were you kind of taking care of things in the background?
I don't think there was much background, but I think I did some tutoring, but because it was tiny. So to begin with, it was just, I'm trying to think how many were in the operations team, something like two. We had Boris Chesnik from the Royal College of Art, who was our operations manager at the RCA. He came and joined the school. So we knew we had someone we could trust. And then when Boris left, we got Stephanie Rice, who was just a brilliant overachiever in organizing things. So working in tandem with them to ensure that the operations work and trying to keep the show on the road. But really the CEO's role is to make sure there's enough money, bring in the money from tuition fees, sponsors, patrons, make sure that it's robust enough to pass all the regulatory hurdles. And we managed to secure every single piece of regulatory accreditation that we went for, which is great, and first time with all of them. So that was a successful track record of doing that. So it's just trying to just get through all the gateposts, because actually starting a new school, there was so many threshold points that you had to meet. You know, you couldn't at the time apply for certain like centralized support until you had 3 years accounts. So we had our first accounting period in January to January, trying to get that track record so we could get into the government system. So there was lots of things that just you had to do by stages. We had to have a quality assurance review. We had to meet HEFKey funding requirements. All this stuff takes time to do. You can't do it overnight.
Yeah. And I mean, part of me also thinks, I mean, I remember hearing in your leaving speech at the LSA that you would like to make some money after leaving LSA as well. And you know, that would suggest that it wasn't a very profitable venture.
I think it's it's a charity. I mean, it's a charity that has an educational purpose, and I think that there has to be a reasonable balance between, you know, there's what people are paid and how it works. And when you start something, there is a kind of founder zeal, and I say that of all the founding faculty, everyone put a lot of time in to make something as a charitable activity that they weren't being remunerated for in a way that is necessarily fair when you look at other institutional benchmarks. And I think as we've matured and people have left and you have to hire new people, you have to make sure that you have enough money to hire people of sufficient quality that the show keeps on the road. So it has to mature as an institution to make sure that it is, you know, benchmarkable and competitive in the marketplace for great tutors, which I think it is. No one goes into academia to make money. So it's not, I felt I'd done 10 years on the project and it was time to think about what the next project was. And some aspiration for it is to make money, but also a big aspiration is, what impact do I want to make in the world? How can I make further impact? What scale can that be at? So something like coming to America is a way to find a huge test bed, both in terms of resource, but also challenges, and be able to find a community of people also engaged in issues like this, and then think about where I should put my energy.
Well, yeah, I mean, two things I would say to that as well is, well, one is a question I'll ask at the end is, but you know, on the topic of profit and money, and I think, you know, from the guests I've spoken to, you know, we've had Chris Hildry in one of the episodes who talked about, you know, what a social enterprise is, and actually, you know, if you are going to have a huge impact on society or on change that you're passionate about, then making money is a very important part of the process. And, also this should be nothing to shy away from when it comes to making sure it's worth your time and everyone else's time, because that would then enable you to have a quality of life or whatever, or circumstance, so that you can contribute your highest level. So, I completely understand that aspect of it.
So what you learn here, I mean, I've been going to a couple of courses at Harvard Business School. One is called social entrepreneurship and systems change, and the other is purpose and profit. How do you unite purpose and profit? And the systems change one is great. I mean, it's sort of informed by thinking at MIT, which really invented systems change thinking. And what you learn here is have the biggest idea possible. And if you can convey that, you will get people to back you. It's as easy to get 100 million as it is to get 1 million in terms of the due diligence, because the amount of work someone's got to do is the same. So I think one thing I'm trying to think about here, and as a kind of learning, is LSA was very incremental. It was a charity that asked people for 5, 10, 15, 20,000 pounds, small amounts of money from quite a broad base of people. I think now I'm interested in how can I focus on a really big impact and then try and fund it and resource it in a way that is more sustainable. And also can scale more easily.
And so that's a remarkable kind of thing to be taught just now, which is about, when it comes to funding things, whether you ask for 1 million or 100 million, there's no difference. There's still there's still the stakeholder or the shareholder or whatever who is parting from a large sum of money. But what is the difference then in terms of, because you say there's the same amount of work involved, surely?
I mean, I'm sort of making up those figures a bit, but we've definitely been told that some institutions who have money and invest, they won't look at a project below 10 million. It's not worth their while. It's not worth their time. They're looking for something that they are convinced will have impact. And if you can demonstrate how it will have impact and how you can make it have further impact, you can get the resources if you show how you will do it, and if they believe you.
Where are investors? I know that's a strange question, but where would one go and find investment from? Let's say I've got an incredible idea already on my hard drive now.
There's more in America than there is in the UK. America has a much greater appetite for investing in ventures that may succeed. So there's a culture of, let's say 9/10 of their investments will fail, but one of them might be Google. So, or whatever, like there's that appetite here in a way that I think is slightly different to London, that is slightly more conservative, especially around younger entrepreneurs.
There must be an associated risk or downfall by that framework, right?
Yeah, you can fail. I mean, if you fail in Britain, if your business goes bust in Britain, you're sort of a pariah. No one's interested. If you fail in America, it's a kind of badge of honor. They'll phone you up the next day to give you more money. It's not seen as a problem failing here. It's part of the culture of experimenting.
That's incredible, because my question was actually why take your brilliance to America? Why not bring in the patriotic energy and keep the innovations flowing here? I mean, do you intend to come back to the UK and push some agendas?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to come back at some point, but I also feel it on the precipice here of making new connections and starting to settle in, and feeling my way into something new. So I will always be British, but but America seems like a great place to be for a bit if I can make it work.
You seem like a kind of a Zuckerberg and a kind of I mean, you give me that vibe, and I feel honored to have spoken to you. And I think that it'd be a massive shame to not just kind of ask on a very informal level. There's probably a lot of students listening to this right now who are in university, in universities all around the world. And I suppose they'd be wondering from someone like yourself, one, what do you advise to them to, succeed in the profession they find themselves in this incredibly challenging uh, educational system as well, but with all of the uncertainties of the future that lie ahead as well, because as we know, the ARB are announcing massive changes, and we could see the part 1 and 2 and 3 systems scrapped. In fact, that's likely to happen. How do young students navigate themselves in a profession that is seems to be on kind of unsteady feet right now?
I mean, some advice I'd give is don't worry about being the best. Just do enough to get by. Just in university, it doesn't matter about getting the top marks, really. I mean, I shouldn't say that as someone who's been out of school, but actually, I don't think you should feel the pressure to be the top in an institution. I think if you take the pressure off and allow yourself to think and just do what feels right for you, and really try to construct the design basis that represents your values. And that might not be the same thing as the institution's values. You might be at loggerheads with it in some ways, but don't worry about that. Just do enough to get through in some ways. Because I think the people who are top at universities aren't necessarily the ones who end up being the best practitioners. Some of the people who don't do particularly well in university end up being the best practitioners. It's no great predictor of what's going to happen next. So I would engage with the education system in a way that just it's a route to get to the next bit. Use it for your own ends, and don't worry too much about the grades. When you get to the profession, figure out what values you have, and then also figure out how you can create value for others. How are you valuable? What can you offer to the planet and the profession? And be kind of direct in how you construct that offer to people, what you can do to help them. Because if, the greatest question you can ask someone, whoever you're working with, is how can I help? What is it that I can do to make this better?
That's incredible advice. And it's, I mean, as a young professional myself who is very happy to hear the advice you just gave as well, because I find myself on a similar route where I'm kind of creating my own, I suppose, value resource that I am able to provide. I feel very grateful that I'm able to provide some value through speaking with extraordinary people like yourself and kind of sharing these insights. But at the same time, I'm also keeping one foot firm in the profession and thinking, where is my place there? And what can I add to the company that I'm working for? Am I correct in thinking that architecture is going to head into a world where the role of the architect is not going to be defined to someone who just creates buildings? And I know I'm simplifying that, and many people would argue 50 years ago that that's not what the role of the architect was and ever meant to be. But I speak kind of in from the perspective of the lay people, because I think that's a good gauge, the public, because I think that's a good gauge to see where the value lies. You ask this fundamental question of how can I help, which that's talking about value. So if the public sees our value as people who create buildings, and I did a video actually where I went and spoke to people on the streets in London and asked them questions like these. I mean, I was surprised to hear that people were saying, well, actually, you guys should be paid 70, 80, 100 plus K a year because you guys designed the world we live in, right? And it's like, Will, I know it's a difficult question, but why don't we earn so much more money than we do?
I think because Margaret Thatcher introduced legislation that meant that there weren't any regulated salaries, so that enabled competition. So it was a race to the bottom to compete on fees. We then also lost, as a profession, sort of key parts of the things we used to do, which was, manage the construction process. We lost bits of the profession to other professionals in adjacent built environment. And I think that's just, we've become more marginalized. So I think finding ways for us to re-engage and reconnect with the things that we can do and other ways that we can create value. And ultimately, creating value is something you charge for. That's the whole point of creating value too. is that it's how can you help a community or a user group inhabit a space, but also you need to be able to charge for that. And articulating what the value you bring is a way to help bring in the fees.
And so in this new landscape, which I suppose in some ways we just have to deal with, because changing these these Tory institutionalized damages are probably not going to be easy and not and by no means fast. So dealing with this new kind of constriction that we find ourselves in with our roles as architects, should we try to get back control of the built environment from these kind of developers and contractors and all these kind of other players who seem to be dominating the built environment? Or should we really embrace the multidisciplinary potential of architecture and the kind of the diversified role that the architect could have? Or is it all of the above?
I mean, I think one thing that I find interesting about where the profession might position itself is, you mentioned Mark Zuckerberg, who is now talking about creating the metaverse, and the idea that they've renamed the company Meta, and there's sort of futurity where we are all engaging with each other in alternative reality. And I think that is a challenge in some ways to what real reality can be. And does it then supplant the built environment? What is the future of how we will engage with each other? Is it going to mean actually we travel less and that helps the environment, or does it actually mean that we so disengage with what's real with nature that we don't care for it? And I think there's some real questions about the relationship of digital space to real space. And you look like you're in the metaverse already with your background. So I think that will be increasingly questioned. And it's interesting. I mean, my view is we've got to cherish the actual real world we live in. And I would completely disinvent social media if I could.
I mean, that's a big claim. Why that?
I don't think it's good for humanity. I'm so glad I grew up in a time where I didn't have to be on Instagram and Twitter and constantly represent myself as a teenager and try and present myself to be cool in that way. I really don't see it as very positive.
But then what do you say to, I mean, it's surprising to hear that from an entrepreneurial minded person. The obvious kind of the arguments I would say to that are obviously, its ability to mobilize the change and, the movements that no other, I mean, we talked about it, didn't we? In the sense that a disruptor is only a disruptor in so much that it can mobilize its message, and social media certainly plays a massive role in that.
Well, also disruption can be disruptive, and there are effects that can be good and bad. I mean, maybe it's too much of a polemical position, but I certainly think that, things like Twitter that coarsen debate to people expressing rage and not, I don't think it's very good for the political process in some ways. I think we need to, it's given voice to a kind of wave of populism in a way that I think is destabilizing to political institutions on which we rely to make the world function.
There's 100%, I 100% agree with the idea that, the algorithm plays a massive role in perpetuating populist opinion, and that's not let's say the balanced discourse to have in society. So, 100% see a perspective there.
It also causes a lot of depression with people, and I don't know. I mean, I'm on Twitter, but I don't ever say anything. I'm not on Instagram. I would disappear. I'm on LinkedIn. I would disappear from these things if I could.
I know your feeling, and it's a scary thing to think about the metaverse as well, though, because for the same reasons, if we get stuck in a reality where you can't run away from that, let's say we become dependent on the metaverse for said functions like whatever meetings or any platform, because obviously if everybody is engaging in a metaverse meeting room, you've got no choice but to engage with it, and we could be stuck in a
maybe it's an opportunity for architects that you can design anything you want. There's no costs. You can design the best buildings in the world. You don't have to worry about a carbon footprint. Well, in a sense, though, you did. I read the other day that all of the Bitcoin in the world uses something like the same energy as, I can't remember which country, I think it's Norway. It's a huge amount of energy just creating this digital currency. You think it has no cost, but it's got a huge cost.
That is really fascinating. Yeah. And the last couple of episodes on this podcast, well, by the time this episode airs, will have been things, I've got one episode dedicated to the metaverse and the architect's role in the metaverse with an amazing friend of mine, Faisal UK. That'd be episode 17. Actually, released today in relative to me, new world today, not the listeners. So it does seem to me that you are optimistic of the future for the future of the role of the architect to diversify further. Am I correct in thinking that?
I'm just generally optimistic. So I think there's never been a better time to be alive than now. Let's put it that way. Everything.
But forget about life. What about architecture? Is it a good time to be an architect right now?
Yes. Well, there's pressing challenges and opportunities that if you engage with them, you can do something brilliant. There's never been a more urgent and brilliant time to be a designer.
That's amazing. And it's like, I mean, if anything gives me optimism, it's yes, challenges. I think challenges will always exist, and therefore problem solvers will always exist. And architects have been known to call themselves problem solvers because of the nature of, as you say, the variety of professions we need to be involved in and whatnot. But what gives me a lot of hope is thinking, well, we keep seeing precedent recently, and I don't know what it's because of. And if you want to look at things in hindsight and see the macro picture, there are going to be massive forces throughout history that have caused there to be kind of shifts in paradigms. And I think we're going through a bit of a paradigm shift now in the field, where people are realizing that the role of the architect is changing. And you were a disruptive force in many ways with the LSA, but at the moment, the ARB are making changes to the system, educational system, for the first time in 50 years. So there is something drastic going on right now, wouldn't you say?
I mean, touching on your point about architecture being a problem-solving discipline, I think it is that, but it's also about creating opportunities. We can't just solve problems, we've got to create opportunities for people. And it's about navigating the world in a way that creates more opportunity for how we can connect with each other, and also creating places that people want to live and can live in accordance with their values and in harmony, with nature as a partner rather than as something to be exploited. So I think that is a critically interesting area of interest for all designers to be thinking about.
100%. Well, it's been amazing. And
the ARB, I don't know enough about what they're doing. I've checked out of the UK at the moment, so I've no idea what they're.
Well, no one really does know, to be honest. They've just announced that they will be making massive changes. I've heard kind of, people who probably are in the know talk about combining the part 1s and 2s into a combined course. I've heard that they'll be allowing for a much more accessibility into the profession, and there'll be less kind of bureaucracy and who can take part in an architecture course, less emphasis on grades perhaps. So I think all of these things will open up the profession to be even more flexible and diversify the role of the architect, which there are many worries associated with that as well, which we could probably discuss.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that there's not too many changes from the ARB. It wouldn't surprise. The RIBA has been talking about changing the model of education for a long time, and it's quite hard. So I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being a more conservative transition than perhaps is the rhetoric at the moment. But I could be wrong. It could be radical. I don't know.
You're probably right. You're probably the realistic voice, kind of bringing more, realism to me. I think I probably play a bit of a role in that rhetoric on these podcasts, talking about drastic changes about to take place. But
the AIB is probably terrified to hear this from you.
Well, it's their fault. They said it first, and they put a survey out as well, asking people how they expect it to be changing. But whatever the case, I think the LSA played a massive role in initiating the acceptance of change in what was and still kind of is a very rigid field and practice. And it's such a shame to think, if those fees didn't hike up, then maybe there'd be, and we wouldn't be having these kind of intense conversations about the role of the architect. I mean, maybe it's a good thing, but it just shows the interconnectedness of how things get affected, just by a government hiking up the price a little bit at uni.
Well, the LSA only became possible because tuition fees were put up,
right?
Because then there was an ability to undercut and create a market in a way that it wasn't before. It was more of a closed shop. So that enabled a new entrant, alongside the government also saying, we want new entrants into the market to stimulate competition. Ultimately, we were advised by our access and participation partners that actually students tend to go for tuition, of the higher tuition fees. They sort of think that a higher tuition fee means you're getting better quality. And as we've gone through all the regulatory hurdles, that puts in place lots of processes that you have to deal with that actually cost more money. So it's ended up that our tuition fees are pretty much level with other schools because of the additional nature of the regulatory burden. But then you also get the integrated work placement. I think the real challenge for the school will be, how does it keep innovating, particularly in the provision of new opportunities, whether that's at part one level or professional education, or how can it keep innovating?
I'm glad you said that, because my next final question, or finalized kind of set questions, were on what you think is going to happen with the LSA now that you've left, because as I understand, you're no longer affiliated, or you still are?
I'm obviously the founder still, but I'm no longer participating with the school. I was going to, and then I felt actually the move to America, the Loeb Fellowship, really encouraged people to cut all ties with their previous roles and really focus on the fellowship. And it felt trying to divide my time between both would have been pretty challenging. And I think it's also good that if you are the founder, you leave properly and enable the new person to have space to do something without feeling that someone's looking over their shoulder and making comments. And you don't want a backseat driver. So I think it's important that there's a new driver in place, and that the school has that opportunity. So I'm excited to see what they do next.
That's amazing. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to have been on the show.
No, I've been wanting to get you on for a very long time, and people will know I don't like to do virtual discussions because you get so much more from the interaction in person, but I've had to conform, and it seems worth it, because value has been extracted, and that's the important thing.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Any final parting words before we leave you? I'm sure there's a lot going on. Some people want to kind of plug the projects they're working on, but I'm sure by the sounds of it, you're just in your cave, getting on with your innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite scary to go and do something new, but also the opportunity to think afresh about the challenges and try and, for me, setting something up is a different set of challenges to running something. And I really like the idea stage of thinking about possibilities and then thinking about how to construct them. And so that is an exciting moment for me. And now that I'm 40, I feel I should really get serious with my life.
Everything sounds pretty serious up until now anyway, but you know, please come back to the UK and hit me up, and maybe we can have a coffee, and I hope to stay connected with you, and
or even a proper drink.
Yes, please, whatever you like. Thank you so much once again, and see you guys on the next episode.
Bye, take care. Thank you.